So today's session is on the quadratic formula. So I do have a video in the classroom. Hi, Brittany. Let me know if you're able to hear me fine. I'm going to just keep an eye on the chat. I want to make sure everybody can hear me. So, let's see. Chat's going off. Why isn't? Okay. It says, Brittany, you raised your hand. Does that mean you can hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So, quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula, where it comes from is from completing the square. You guys are not required to learn completing the square. That's section 9.2, which you are not required to read. I know some people have read that section. You don't have to. So you don't need to do that. So the people who have done that, they're just kind of getting ahead of the game, I guess. So completing the square is not required, but that's where the equation basically comes from. So the formula is x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, and then the whole thing is over 2a. So I've made my square root a little bit too big. So that is the formula. Basically, this is a way to solve a quadratic equation, and a quadratic equation is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this is a way to solve it. It will work every time. So there are some quadratic equations that you can solve by factoring, but you can't factor everything. So if you can't factor, then you use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to just write that down. So if you can't factor, use the quadratic formula. And I say that you can use the quadratic formula every time, but when you're trying to solve something that you can factor, it's actually, you're less likely to make mistakes if you do it by factoring than if you're using the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula has a lot more steps, and so sometimes it can get more complicated. So that's why we want to use factoring whenever possible. But you'll get the same answer either way. So my first example here is going to be one that you can solve by factoring. And I will first solve it by factoring, and then we will also solve it using the quadratic formula. So if we're given a quadratic equation, x squared plus 3x, let's see, I'm trying to make something up in my head. Let's see, actually let's do plus x and then minus 3. Yeah, so we'll start with something simple. So we have x squared plus x minus 3. So if we solve this by factoring, we are going to set up our parentheses, and then we still have our equals 0. And we're basically filling in 4 spots. And then we have signs. We have either plus or a minus, or we have both pluses, or they can be both minuses. So since our middle is positive, and the second number is negative, that means we're going to have opposite signs. We're going to have a plus and a minus, because you have to have these multiplying to a negative. So in order to get x squared, that comes from the first term. So I know I have to have x in both of the first places in the parentheses, because x times x gets me x squared. Now the last spots, those are the ones I haven't filled in yet. Those need to multiply to, actually that should be minus 6. There we go. That will work. Those have to multiply to 6, negative 6. So our choices are 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. And we want to put them in the right place so that when you multiply the insides and the outsides, they add to 1. So if I have a positive 3 and then a negative 2, when I multiply the insides, 3 times x is 3x, and then x times a negative 2 is minus 2x. And when you combine these, 3x minus 2x is 1x, so that gets us our middle. So when you're solving by factoring, once you factor, you set each thing equal to 0. So you have x plus 3 equal to 0, and then x minus 2 equal to 0. So everything in parentheses is set equal to 0, and then you solve for x. So I'd be subtracting 3 from both sides. And my first answer is x equals negative 3. And then I add 2 to both sides. And my second answer is x equals 2. So that's solving by factoring. We can get the same answer using the quadratic formula. So I'm going to do that on the right here. So with the quadratic formula, we have to identify a, b, and c. So we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And we're comparing our actual quadratic is x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. So a is equal to 1 because we don't have a number in front of the x squared, and you can always put a 1 in front of there. Just like we don't have a number in front of the x, so we can always put a 1. So that means b is equal to 1. Then c is equal to negative 6. So your first step when you're going to use the quadratic formula is to identify what a, b, and c are, and to make sure you write those down. It's really important to have those written down because what happens is because the formula is kind of confusing, or it's got a lot of steps, people put the numbers in the wrong place. So by making sure you've written them down, it's a little easier to find your mistakes. So now I'm going to rewrite the quadratic formula again, and I recommend that you write it every single time, so that way you start to, it kind of gets stuck in your head and you start to memorize it. So x equals negative b plus or minus, and then we have the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So the first step is to actually plug in the values. So everywhere that I see a, I'm going to plug in 1 because a is equal to 1. Everywhere that I see b, I'm also going to plug in 1 because b is equal to 1. And then everywhere that I see c, we are going to replace that with negative 6. So we're going to be plugging in numbers in multiple places here, and it's important to plug in the correct numbers. So color coding could be very helpful here. So we start with negative b. So negative and then b is 1. So every time I plug in a number, I'm going to put parentheses around it. Then we have plus or minus. And I will talk about what the plus or minus means as we go through, once we get to the point where we need new means. Right now, just copy the symbol. Then we have our square root. And we have b, so b is 1, so that's going to be 1 squared minus 4, and then a, so that's times 1. And then c, which is negative 6.
Oh, I did that before you had put it on there.
Perfect, yeah. I'm trying to go very slowly because it's really easy to make mistakes here. So you plug in all of the numbers, and now you need to start following the order of operations. And this is the part where mistakes are made. There's multiple places to make mistakes. One is you're putting the number in the wrong place, or 2, you're doing the order of operations wrong. So that's why I always caution when I'm using the quadratic formula. So order of operations, just as a refresher, is PEM dash. So we have parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, and addition and subtraction. When it comes to the quadratic formula, your first step would be simplifying inside the square root. We're going to sort of consider that like parentheses because they're grouped together. And so when you do that, your first step would be to do the exponents. And then you're going to do the multiplication. And that would be that 4 times 1 times -6. And then you're going to be doing your subtraction. And then what you will do is take the square root and the button on the calculator. So if it's not something you can do in your head, there is a calculator button for that. And then once you've done the square root, then step 3 would be to multiply in the denominator. And then we're still following the order of operations. So we've gone through the square root stuff. We've done all the multiplication, division things. Next would be addition and subtraction. So you have this plus or minus on the top. So we're going to actually create 2 equations. And these are coming from the plus or minus. And I will demonstrate that. Just going to write down all the steps here. Then once you've done that, then you do your addition or subtraction. And then you simplify your fractions. So this is the order of operations that we're going to be solving or following to solve this quadratic formula that we have. So there's a lot of steps. It's going to take, it takes a while. It will take up a lot of space. So I'm going to just kind of move everything over here to the right so that I can do it on the left side here, from the right to the left. So we have our things set up. First is simplifying inside the square root, so we want to do the exponents. So that means this 1 squared we're going to square. So everything else I have to rewrite. X equals -1 plus or minus square root. Now I do the exponent. 1 squared is 1, so I can just replace that with 1. Then I have this -4 times 1 times -6 all over 2 times 1. So that was exponents. So I can just say, okay, I did that. Next is the multiplication, the 4 times 1 times -6. So this part right there. That minus in front, you can think of that as a -4. So what might be helpful is if you turn that minus as plus and negative, and then you're doing all of the multiplication using a -4. So we would have -4 times 1 times -6. And you can just do those all on your calculator or in your head. So I have my 1 plus, and then -4 times 1 times -6 gives us a positive 24. So I'm going to write plus 24. And then it's over 2 times 1. So I did the multiplication that's inside the square root. And for step 3, because I made this, sometimes the negatives turn into addition, as we have here, our negatives canceled out, so addition. So now we're going to do subtraction and addition. So we're going to add this 1 plus 24. So I start, once again, I have to rewrite everything. So 1 plus 24 is 25. So I have the square root of 25. So I have -1 plus minus the square root of 25 over 2 times 1. So now I've simplified inside the square root. The next step is to take the square root. So you're going to take the square root of 25. So you can do this on your calculator. So my calculator has a square root button. Most do. Mine is actually above the x squared button. So I have to hit second to get my square root, and then you just type in 25. And you get a whole number here. We get 5. So we're going to write this as x equals -1 plus or minus 5 over 2 times 1. Sometimes you get decimals when you take a square root, and that's fine, because we're just going to be using what the calculator tells us. So step 3 here is now to multiply in the denominator. So I need to do, the 2 times 1. So I'm going to do 2 times 1. So I have x equals -1 plus or minus 5 over 2. Because 2 times 1 is 2. So I've taken care of that step. Now this is where the plus or minus thing comes in. Create 2 equations from the plus or minus. So a quadratic equation, it has an exponent of 2, and that means we should have 2 answers. And we combine those answers using the plus or minus. What that means is that we have the same equation with the plus and then the same equation with the minus. So, one equation, I write this with a plus sign, -1 plus 5 over 2. And then I write it with the minus sign, x equals -1 minus 5 over 2. So that plus or minus is a way to write 2 equations in one way so that you don't have to write it twice. But we do have to separate it out when we do the math. So once you've gotten to the point where you have done all the multiplication and you're just left with a number plus or minus a number over a number, that's where you have to create your 2 equations. So I'm going to just highlight. We had to do the plus or minus part. Now you're going to do your addition and subtraction on the tops of these fractions. So I'm going to move to the right. So on my top equation with the plus, -1 plus 5 is 4. So I got 4 over 2. And then with the 1 with the subtraction, -1 minus 5 is -6 over 2. So I did my addition and the subtraction. And now you simplify the fractions. So if they come out to a whole number, awesome. If they don't, you leave them as a fraction. Or if you have decimals already, you could leave them as a decimal. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. -6 divided by 2 is -3. So we get 2 answers, 2 and -3. And that's the last step. So now I'm going to zoom out so you can see those are the same answers that we got when we did it by factoring. But you can see that it was a lot more work. But you do get the same answers. So this is why I suggest that you try to factor first, because it's a lot less work. The factoring part, just, took this much space. You know, that wasn't too bad. But using the quadratic formula took up this much space and all of that space. So it's a lot more steps. But you do get the same answer both times. So are there any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to zoom back in. Okay, so now I've got a second example here. And we have 3n squared plus 5n minus 2 equals 0. and we're going to solve this. So even though the letter is n, we can still use the quadratic formula. The difference is that you're going to write n equals instead of x equals. But the steps are all the same. So the value in front of the squared is a. What's in front of the regular variable without an exponent is b. And then the number part, the constant by itself, is c. So a is equal to 3, b is equal to 5, c is equal to -2. So if there's a negative in front of these or a minus, you include that with the value. So quadratic formula, I'm going to rewrite it. This time I'm going to use n equals because our variable is n. So it's -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times ac all over 2a. So again, I'm going to just kind of try to color code everywhere. So everywhere that a goes, I'm going to be plugging in 3. Everywhere b goes, I'm going to be plugging in 5. And then everywhere c goes, we'll be plugging in -2. So I have a negative, and then I put parentheses around each number that I'm plugging in. So that's a negative, and then the 5 plus or minus 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times -2. Now make sure when you're writing, you make sure that your square root goes over everything. So if you didn't make it long enough, then you have to make it longer. Make sure your fraction line is long enough. And then 2 times a, which is 3. So I'm just plugging in all of the numbers. And then we want to start going through the order of operations. So the first step will be that exponent. We're going to be squaring that. So what you can do is everything going down, or what you can do is everything going to the right and then move to the down when you run out of space. So I'm going to just try to go from left to right, then when I run out of space, I'm going to move below. So I have -5 plus or minus. So 5 squared is 25. So I have 25 there now. And then I'm going to turn that -4 as plus -4 times 3 times -2. And I'm going to make sure my square root goes all the way. And then 2 times 3. So after you've done your exponent, next is to do the multiplication inside the square root. So we have to do that 4 times, or the -4 times 3 times -2. So since I don't have enough room there, I'm going to move down to the bottom. -5 plus or minus 25 inside the square root plus, then -4 times 3 is -12, and -12 times -2 is a positive 24. So I have 25 plus 24, and then 2 times 3 in my denominator. Next step is to do the addition inside the square root. Whoops, I just accidentally erased things. I accidentally hit my eraser while I was writing. So we're going to add the 25 plus 24. So I'm going to move to the right again just to try to save space. So I have my -5 plus or minus, and then 25 plus 24 is 49. So I'm going to have 49, and then that's inside the square root, and then that's over 2 times 3. Next step is to take the square root of 49. So you're going to do that on your calculator, and that will give you 7. So you're going to have -5 plus or minus 7 over 2 times 3. So now in our denominator, we have 2 times 3. So we're going to multiply those together. So this is -5 plus or minus 7, and then 2 times 3 is 6. So now I'm going to split up to the 2 equations, and because I might not have enough room, I'm going to do them this way. I'm just kind of trying to make things fit because it is a lot of steps going on. So we're going to split that plus or minus into 2 equations. So we have n equals -5 plus 7 over 6, and n equals -5 minus 7 over 6. So now we're going to do our addition and our subtraction on each of these. So I have n equals, so -5 plus 7 is 2, so that's going to come out to 2 over 6. On my second equation, -5 minus 7 is -12, so that's -12 over 6. Now we're going to simplify the fractions. So n equals, and then 2 over 6 you can divide by 2 and you get 1/3. So you can divide each of those by 2 to reduce it. So one answer is 1/3. Our second answer, -12 divided by 6, that actually divides evenly, and that gives us -2. So we get for our 2 answers 1/3 and -2. And you can see it's a very lengthy process here. One thing to note is if you get whole number answers, or fractions, then you could have factored. So we could have solved this one by factoring if we wanted to. Are there any questions? Okay. We've got another example. This one is going to be a little interesting. So let's have x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 0. So I can put a 1 in front of the x squared so that you can see your a, b, and c. So a is going to be 1, b is going to be -6, and then c is equal to 9. So I'm going to just color code this. And so b is now a negative value because we have that minus there. And then our constant, the number by itself, is positive, so c is positive. So I'm going to write the quadratic equation. It's -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Oops. And so I'm going to color code so I make sure I'm plugging in everything into the right place. So the first step is to plug in the values. So it's -b. And remember, when you plug in a number, you put it in parentheses. So you'll see what happens is that we actually have a negative and then our -6. So it's really important to make sure that you don't lose a negative, because sometimes that happens where people lose a negative because they already think, well, B is already negative. But it's basically saying we have the opposite of B. So if B is negative, we're going to have two negatives and it's going to become positive. We have a plus or minus. Now again, I need to put my values in parentheses. So if we have -6 squared, when you put it in your calculator, you need to include those parentheses, because when you square a negative, you get a positive out. So that's really important. And then that's 4 times 1, and then times 9, and then 2 times 1. So, order of operations, exponent. So we have to do that -6 squared. So I have a -6 plus or minus. Now -6 squared is -6 times -6. So you're going to get a positive 36. And then I'm going to have my plus and minus. I'm going to turn that -4 into plus -4 times 1 times 9. Make sure my square root goes all the way across. And then it's over 2 times 1. Next step is the multiplication inside the square root. So we have to do the -4 times 1 times 9. So x equals -6 plus or minus square root of 36. The -4 times 1 times 9 is -36. So that's going to be 36 minus 36. And then that's over 2 times 1. So now we're going to combine what's inside the square root. In this case, it's subtraction. So we're going to do 36 minus 36. So we have -6 plus or minus. And we get 0 inside our square root, because 36 minus 36 is 0. And then that's over 2 times 1. The next step is to take the square root of 0. So the square root of 0 actually is 0. So we are going to end up with -6 plus or minus 0 over 2 times 1. If you have plus or minus 0, you're not adding anything or you're not subtracting anything, because you're just adding 0 and subtracting 0. So really what we have is -6 over 2 times 1. So this is a special case where there's only one solution. It's basically you're going to get the same answer twice. If you get the same answer with the plus 0 as you do with the -0. So there's going to be one solution. So I'm going to be doing my multiplication now. So a -6 becomes a positive 6, and 2 times 1 is 3. I mean, 2 times 1 is not 3. 2 times 1 is 2. My brain is working ahead because 6 divided by 2 is equal to 3. So we get one answer in this case, and this is a special case. So this is a special case. One answer, because you get a square root of 0. And this is one of our special products. Oops. This is the square of a binomial. So when you were learning about multiplying out things, this actually factors to x minus 3 squared. So it's a special case where you get one solution, because you basically have the parentheses are the same, or you basically have one set of parentheses equal to 0. Are there any questions? Okay. I have another example, and this one's going to give us decimals so that you can see what you do when you have decimals. So we have 2a squared plus 5a equals 1. So keep in mind when you have a quadratic, you have to have it equals to 0. This is not equal to 0, so we have to subtract 1 from both sides first. So I have to get one side equal to 0 by subtracting 1. So that I have 2a squared plus 5a minus 1 equal to 0. Once it's equal to 0, then you can use the quadratic formula. And actually, you know what? A is going to be confusing because we have a in the quadratic formula. So let's just use y. I don't want to confuse you guys too much there. So with the quadratic formula, the value that's with the squared term is a. So a is equal to 2. What's in front of the regular term without the exponent, y in this case, is going to be your b, so that's 5. And then c is negative 1. So I'm going to write the quadratic formula. In this case, our variable is y, so instead of x equals, it's going to be y equals. So we have y equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So a is going to be 2, b is going to be 5, and then c is negative 1. So we get negative, and then parentheses every time I plug in a number. So that's going to be parentheses around the 5, plus or minus square root, parentheses for plugging in a number, so that's going to be 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, and then times c, which is negative 1, and then it's all over 2a, so that's going to be 2 times 2. Now we start going through the order of operations. We're going to do our exponent, or 5 squared. So I have negative 5 plus or minus square root. Now 5 squared is 25, so I have 25. I'm going to turn that minus 4 into adding a negative 4, then times 2 times negative 1. And then that's all over 2 times 2. Next is the multiplication. So we're going to do the negative 4 times 2 times negative 1. So y equals negative 5 plus or minus square root. I have 25. And then negative 4 times 2 times negative 1 is a positive 8. So it's going to be plus 8 all over 2 times 2. The next step is to add, oops, I accidentally erased again. The erase button is right where my fingers are holding the pen. So we're going to add the 25 plus 8. So we have negative 5 plus or minus square root, and 25 plus 8 is 33. So I'm going to get 33 underneath there, and then 2 times 2. Now we're going to take the square root of 33. So you're going to do that on your calculator. And this is one where we get a decimal. So it doesn't come out, and you get like basically tons of decimal places there. So I'm going to just, if you take the square root of 33, my calculator gives me 5.7445626647. So we're going to basically round in 2 decimal places. So I'm going to put a line after the 2 decimal places. If the number after that line is 5 or higher, I round up. Otherwise, it stays the same. So since the number after the line is 4, it's below 5, I don't round up. The number stays the same. So I'm going to use 5.74. So this will give me -5 plus or minus 5.74 over 2 times 2. So the next step is to take to do the multiplication there, the 2 times 2. So this will be -5 plus or minus 5.74 over 4. And now we get into the 2 separate equations because now we want to do the plus or minus part. So one of them, we have y equals -5 plus 5.74 over 4. And then we have y equals -5 minus 5.74 over 4. Once you've written your 2 equations, now you're going to do that addition and the subtraction. So, oops. Y equals, I get -5 plus 5.74, so that comes out to 0.74 over 4. And then we have y equals -5 minus 5.74, -10.74 over 4. Now, we don't like to keep decimals inside a fraction, so we're going to just divide these and write the decimal form, because decimals and fractions don't mix. So 0.74 divided by 4, I get 0.185. So that's one answer. And then I have -10.74 divided by 4, which gives me -2.685. So that's my second answer. So in this case, we get 2 answers that are decimals, which is fine. This was one that if you get decimals like this, that means you could not have factored. This is something that can only be solved by the quadratic formula. So decimals means we can only use the quadratic formula to solve this one. Any questions? Okay, here's another one. Two x squared plus x plus 5 equals 0. So if I put a 1 in front of my x, that will help me get my a, b, and c. So a is 2, that's in front of the x squared. B is 1, which is in front of the x. And then c is 5. So I'm going to set up the quadratic formula. I have x equals -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I'm just going to color code so I can keep track of what I'm plugging in. So negative parentheses around the b, which is 1, so negative 1, plus or minus square root, so I have 1 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, and then c, which is 5. And then in our denominator, 2 times a, which is 2. So we have 2 times 2. So order of operations, exponent comes first. So I have to do the 1 squared. Negative 1 plus or minus square root. 1 squared is 1. And then I'm going to have plus negative 4 times 2 times 5 all over 2 times 2. Now I'm going to do the multiplication. Negative 4 times 2 times 5. So hopefully you're seeing that we're doing the same steps basically every time. It's just different colors or different numbers. So you can see that there's a pattern of what we do each time. So I actually have room here. So negative 1 plus or minus 1. And then negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times 5 is negative 40. So that's going to be 1 minus 40 over 2 times 2. So now we're going to do 1 minus 40. So I have x equals negative 1 plus or minus, and 1 minus 40 is negative 39. So I have negative 39 inside my square root, and then I have 2 times 2. So now we're going to take the square root of 39. So if you get your calculator out and you type in the square root of 39, you're going to get an error. My calculator says domain error. So if I type in the square root of negative 39, I get what is called a domain error. And that is because we can't take the square root of a negative number. The square root of a negative number is not a real number. So the square root of a negative is not a real number. So if you get something like that, where you get something you can't take the square root of, then your answer is there are no real solutions. When you get to college algebra, there's something called complex numbers. So you can have imaginary solutions, but there are no real solutions. So there are no values, no numbers for x that solve this equation, because we can't do it on the calculator. We'd have to use something called imaginary numbers. Any questions? Okay, now last two, I'm not going to go through full examples of this, but I just want to show some special cases where you might ask yourself, how do you do the quadratic formula? Some special cases. So you might see something like 2x squared plus 5x equals 0, or maybe you'll see 9x squared plus 16, let's do minus 16 equals 0. So there's not three things written down. So for like the 2x squared plus 5x equals 0, you can solve that one by factoring, but you can also fill in the non-x part by writing 0. So your a would be 2, b would be 5, and then in this case c would be 0. So you can still use the quadratic formula, you would just be using it with c equals 0. For the 9x squared minus 16 equals 0, there's no middle term, you don't have an x term, So you can write that as plus 0x, and then you have your minus 16. So you can have 9x squared plus 0x minus 16 equals 0, so that you have your three things. And then if you use the quadratic formula, a is equal to 9. In this case, b is equal to 0. And then c is equal to negative 16. So you can still do the quadratic formula. You're just going to have something equal to 0 in these cases. So that's it. Do you guys have any questions on the quadratic formula for me? On the assignment, your second problem where it says to use the quadratic formula is going to be like this one, where you're going to get decimal values. Just as an FYI. All right, so thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I will try to get this video out as soon as I can. But yeah, and I'll also share this whiteboard kind of thing so you can see that as well. But thank you guys so much for coming on a Saturday night. Hopefully you guys are all staying safe with the coronavirus here in Kansas City. We now, as of today, have a shelter in place. So I will not be leaving the house anytime soon. So hopefully you guys are also staying safe. And if you are worried about the coronavirus, I do have that video that I shared with the roundtable that I did on Thursday. So you can watch that to get some information. You know, these are interesting times, but we're all going to stay safe. And I'm sure, you know, things will work out. Look on the bright side. So thank you guys. I hope you guys have a great night. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye. Thanks, Lou. You take care too.